In the vast expanse of the Galactic Council's territory, where civilized species had evolved on paradise worlds with gentle gravity, perfect atmospheres, and abundant resources, there existed a universal truth that all advanced beings accepted without question. Only the weak survived on harsh worlds. When a distress signal from the Rim territories mentioned a species called humans from something called Earth, the rescue fleets prepared for the usual protocol, extracting another fragile civilization from whatever cosmic disaster had befallen their world. The preliminary scans were promising. The planet showed signs of advanced technology, organized cities, and a population in the billions. But as the sleek vessels of the Altarian Rescue Corps approached the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, their sensors began registering readings that made no sense. The gravity was crushing, nearly twice what most Council species could survive. The atmosphere was a toxic mixture of reactive gases that would corrode most beings' respiratory systems. Massive storms raged across continents with winds that could tear apart their finest ships. The planet's surface was scarred by tectonic violence, radiation bombardment, and temperature extremes that fluctuated wildly across its surface. Commander Zelith of the Altarian fleet stared at the readings in disbelief. This wasn't a planet. This was a death trap. No civilization could have evolved here. The distress signal had to be coming from survivors of a recent crash, probably refugees from some other world who were slowly dying on this hellscape. But then the human response came through their communications array, and everything the galaxy thought it knew about strength, survival, and what it truly meant to be apex predators was about to change forever. The humans weren't asking for rescue. They were offering to help. Commander Zelith's forearms trembled as he processed the impossible data streaming across his command console. The Altarian had spent 3 decades in deep space rescue operations, pulling struggling civilizations from dying worlds, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what his sensors were telling him about the third planet of Sol System. The distress beacon had been weak, but clear, using standard Council frequency protocols. The message itself was brief and formal. This is Earth Central Command requesting immediate assistance with hostile alien incursion. Casualties mounting. Require military support. Standard enough, except for one detail that had puzzled the linguistics department. The signal hadn't come from orbit or from any visible space installations. It had originated from the planet's surface. Commander, his science officer Keth whispered, her usually confident voice cracking slightly. The atmospheric composition readings are confirmed. 21% oxygen in a nitrogen-based atmosphere. That concentration would be lethal to most Council species within minutes. Zelith nodded grimly. Oxygen was one of the most corrosive gases in the known galaxy. Most civilized species breathed noble gas mixtures or carefully regulated combinations that wouldn't literally burn their lung tissue. The idea that any intelligent species could evolve breathing what was essentially a slow-acting poison was unthinkable. And the gravity? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. 9.8 meters per second squared. Keth replied, consulting her instruments with a look of disbelief. Nearly double Altair Prime's gravitational constant. Commander, my calculations show that most Council species would suffer immediate bone fractures just from standing on that surface. The bridge fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems. Zelith's species, like most in the galaxy, had evolved on worlds with gravity between 4 and 6 meters per second squared. Their bones were elegant and hollow, designed for efficiency rather than brute resistance to crushing force. The thought of trying to function under nearly 10 meters per second squared was horrifying. Perhaps they're refugees, suggested his tactical officer, Vash. The young Centauri's crest feathers were fluffed with nervousness. Survivors from some catastrophe who crash-landed and are now trapped on this death world. Zelith considered this. It was the only logical explanation. Some poor species had been stranded on this nightmare planet and were now slowly dying while trying to adapt to impossible conditions. The distress call made sense in that context. They needed evacuation before the hostile environment killed them all. "Bring us into standard orbit," he ordered. "Begin full planetary scans. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before we commit to a surface operation." The results that came back over the next several hours defied every principle of xenobiology that Zelith had learned in his decades of service. The planet wasn't just inhabited, it was thriving. Massive urban centers sprawled across every continent, connected by vast transportation networks. Energy signatures indicated industrial activity on a scale that rivaled some of the Council's most advanced worlds. Most impossibly, the population centers weren't concentrated in the few areas where environmental conditions might be marginally tolerable. They were everywhere, in frozen polar regions where water turned solid, in desert areas where temperatures could cook flesh, even in zones where the planet's tectonic activity regularly reshaped the landscape. "Commander," Ket's voice was barely a whisper, "I'm detecting what appears to be recreational activity in several locations where our survival protocols classify the environment as immediately lethal." "Explain." "Large gatherings of the native species engaging in organized physical activities. One location shows hundreds of individuals deliberately exposing themselves to intense solar radiation while partially submerged in liquid water. Another shows groups engaging in rapid physical movement despite gravitational stress that should crush their skeletal systems." Zelith felt his temperature regulation failing as the implications sank in. These beings weren't struggling to survive on this death world. They were living normal lives. More than that, they seemed to be thriving in conditions that would kill his people in minutes. "Attempt communication," he ordered finally. "Standard Council protocols. Let's find out who we're dealing with." The response came faster than he'd expected, and in perfect Council standard despite never having encountered their language before. The voice that emerged from the communications array was unlike anything in his experience, deeper than most species, with an underlying roughness that spoke of respiratory systems designed to process harsh atmospheric mixtures. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Defense Force. Thank you for responding to our distress call, but I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. We don't need rescue. We need military assistance." Zelith's four hearts nearly stopped. "Admiral Chun, this is Commander Zelith of the Altarian Rescue Corps. Our sensors indicate you're on a Class 12 death world with atmospheric conditions that should be immediately lethal to any known form of intelligent life. Are you certain you don't require evacuation?" There was a pause, and Zelith could hear what sounded like multiple voices conferring in the background. When the human spoke again, there was something in her tone that made his skin crawl. Not fear or desperation, but what almost sounded like amusement. "Commander, I appreciate your concern, but Earth is our homeworld. We evolved here. As for the hostile aliens I mentioned in our distress call, they landed about 6 hours ago and have been attempting to establish a beachhead in what you probably classify as one of our more habitable regions." "More habitable?" Zelith managed to ask. "The Sahara Desert. Temperatures hover around 50 degrees Celsius. Minimal water, constant sandstorms. Figured it might be the only place they could survive long enough for us to attempt negotiations." Zelith looked at his instruments. 50 degrees Celsius was hot enough to kill most Council species through hyperthermia. These humans considered it a comfortable environment for hosting alien visitors. "Admiral, what is the nature of the hostile force you're dealing with?" "They call themselves the Krex Empire. Big, scary-looking things with natural armor plating and what appears to be enhanced strength. They've been conquering primitive worlds across this section of the galaxy for the past few centuries. Showed up here expecting easy pickings." Ket's claws clicked nervously as she pulled up the Krex Empire's file from their database. The Krex were one of the galaxy's most feared military powers, a species of natural-born warriors who had conquered dozens of systems through sheer physical dominance. They stood 3 meters tall, possessed natural body armor, and had strength levels that made them nearly unstoppable in hand-to-hand combat. Most importantly, they were specifically adapted for high-gravity worlds, able to function in environments up to 7 meters per second squared. Admiral, Zelith said carefully, the Kreks are considered one of the most dangerous military forces in known space. If they've chosen to invade your world, I strongly recommend immediate evacuation. Our fleet can begin transport operations within the hour. The sound that came through the communications array took Zelith several seconds to identify. The human was laughing. Commander, that's very kind of you to offer, but we've got the situation well in hand. Actually, we were hoping you might be able to help us with the aftermath. See, we've never had to deal with the diplomatic implications of accidentally wiping out an invasion force before, and we could use some guidance on proper protocol. Accidentally wiping out. Admiral, are you saying you've already engaged the Kreks forces? Well, engage might be too strong a word. They tried to establish their beachhead about 6 hours ago, like I mentioned. Landed about 10,000 troops in the Sahara, started setting up their typical intimidation displays. You know, war cries, shows of strength, demands for immediate surrender. And they lasted about 47 minutes before requesting immediate medical assistance. Zelith's command staff exchanged glances. The Kreks Empire was known for many things, but requesting medical assistance during an invasion wasn't one of them. Admiral, could you clarify what happened during those 47 minutes? Heat exhaustion, mostly. Turns out natural armor plating isn't great for temperature regulation in desert environments. By the time our first response teams reached their landing site, most of them had collapsed. We got them in air-conditioned medical facilities now, pumping them full of fluids and electrolytes. The bridge of the Altarian vessel fell completely silent. The most feared warriors in the galaxy had been defeated by weather that humans considered mildly uncomfortable. There's more, though, Admiral Chen continued. Their advanced scout teams tried to establish secondary positions in what our meteorology department classified as mild conditions. One group landed near what we call the Rocky Mountains. That's a mountain range in North America. Altitude, there is only about 1,400 meters. Temperature was a pleasant 22 degrees Celsius, light breeze. What happened to them? Altitude sickness. Apparently, they're adapted for high gravity, but not thin atmosphere. Had to airlift them down to sea level. Oh, and we had another group try to set up in Ireland. That's an island off the coast of Europe. Really lovely place, green hills, lots of rainfall. Very peaceful. The results? They couldn't handle the humidity. Something about their respiratory systems being designed for dry air. Started having breathing problems within hours. Zelith found himself gripping his command chair with all four arms. Admiral, are you telling me that the Kreks invasion force has been neutralized by environmental factors alone? Pretty much. Though to be fair, we did have to rescue a few of them from our local wildlife. Your wildlife? Yeah, apparently their body heat signatures attracted some of the local predators. Nothing too dangerous by our standards, just some bears and a few mountain lions. But the Kreks seemed pretty intimidated. Can't say I blame them. A grizzly bear is nothing to sneeze at if you're not used to dealing with apex predators. Keth was frantically pulling up Earth's biological database, and what she found made her crest feathers stand on end. The planet wasn't just a death world in terms of environmental conditions. It was populated by some of the most terrifyingly effective predatory species she'd ever encountered. Creatures with bite forces that could crush steel, pack hunters with intelligence levels approaching sentience. Ambush predators that could remain undetected until the moment they struck. Admiral, Zelith said slowly, your planet appears to be inhabited by what our xenobiological databases classify as an unusually high concentration of apex predator species. How do your people coexist with such dangerous fauna? There was another pause, and again that unsettling hint of amusement in the human's voice. Commander, I think there might be some confusion about which species on this planet are the apex predators. Before Zelith could ask for clarification, alerts began flashing across every console on his bridge. Long-range sensors had detected massive energy signatures emerging from Earth's surface, not weapons fire, but something far more sophisticated. Orbital platforms were deploying from hidden facilities, revealing defensive capabilities that made the Altarian fleet's most advanced weaponry look primitive by comparison. Admiral, are those planetary defense systems? Standard protocol when unknown vessels enter Earth space, Chen replied casually. Sorry about that. Should have mentioned it earlier. Don't worry, they're not targeted at you. Your ship's broadcast council identification codes, so our systems recognized you as potential allies. Zealith stared at the tactical display, showing dozens of weapons platforms that could vaporize his entire fleet without effort. These systems were hidden so effectively that his sensors had detected nothing until they were fully active. The level of technology required for such concealment was beyond anything the Council possessed. Admiral, how long has your species possessed such advanced defensive capabilities? Oh, a few decades. We learned pretty quickly that space can be a dangerous neighborhood. Better to be prepared, you know? And the Krex invasion force was unaware of these defenses when they attacked. Well, they didn't exactly attack. They landed and started making demands, like I said. We've been monitoring their fleet for the past 3 days as they approached our system. Honestly, we were curious to see what their standard operating procedure was for planetary conquest. Zealith's mental picture of the situation was rapidly changing. These humans hadn't been surprised by an invasion. They had allowed it to proceed out of curiosity. They had watched one of the galaxy's most feared military forces approach their homeworld and had treated it like an interesting scientific observation. Admiral Chun, he said finally, I believe our understanding of the situation may have been incomplete. When you sent the distress call requesting military assistance, what exactly did you need help with? Well, like I mentioned, we've got about 10,000 Krex warriors in our medical facilities right now. Most of them are physically fine, just needed climate adaptation and altitude adjustment. But they keep asking to speak with our planetary overlords about negotiating surrender terms. Problem is, we don't really have planetary overlords. Our governmental system is a bit more complex than what they're used to dealing with. They want to surrender? Apparently, their invasion protocol assumes that any species capable of surviving on a world like Earth must be incredibly dangerous. When their advanced teams started getting taken down by what we consider normal environmental conditions, their military leadership decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Zealith looked around his bridge at crew members who were all staring at their instruments in shock. The greatest warrior species in the galaxy had invaded Earth, been promptly incapacitated by the weather, rescued by the local inhabitants, given medical treatment, and had immediately requested to surrender. Admiral, I think we may need to reconsider our assessment of the situation. Could we perhaps arrange a formal meeting? The Council will want to establish diplomatic relations, and given what we've learned about your capabilities... Of course, Commander. Fair warning, though, we'll have to meet on the surface. Our orbital facilities don't have life support systems compatible with most galactic species. Didn't think we'd need them. Zealith looked at his atmospheric readings again. The crushing gravity, the corrosive atmosphere, the temperature extremes. Landing on Earth's surface would be like deliberately entering a torture chamber. Admiral, our species aren't adapted for your environmental conditions. A surface meeting might not be possible. No problem. We've got full environmental suits rated for off-world operations. Use them when we started exploring our local system. It should keep you safe. The casual way she mentioned exploring their local system sent another chill through Zealith. Most species didn't develop space travel until they joined the Council. These humans had done it independently while living on a world that would kill most galactic citizens. Admiral, when did your species first achieve space flight? Well, we've been working on it for about 70 years, but we really got serious about it in the last decade when we started detecting signs of galactic civilization. Figured it was time to introduce ourselves. 70 years. Most Council species took centuries to develop safe, reliable space travel, even with guidance and support. These humans had done it in 7 decades, while dealing with environmental challenges that would have wiped out any other known civilization. We'll arrange transport down to the surface, Zealith said finally. But, Admiral, I think there are some things about the galactic community that you should know before we proceed with formal contact. Such as, the other species in the Council. They're not quite like humanity. We've all evolved on worlds that you would probably consider paradise planets. Gentle gravity, stable climates, minimal environmental challenges. Most of us have never encountered anything quite like. Quite like what, Commander? Zealith looked at his tactical display, showing the weapons platforms that could obliterate fleets, at the biological readouts, showing predator species that could tear through armor plating, at the environmental data that describe a world where the very air and gravity would kill most galactic citizens. Quite like you. The environmental suit felt like a prison around Zealith's body as the transport shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere. The reinforced exoskeleton whined softly as it adjusted to compensate for the steadily increasing gravitational pressure, while the atmospheric processors worked overtime to convert the toxic air mixture into something his lungs could process. Through the shuttle's viewports, he watched a world that defied everything he thought he knew about habitability. Massive storm systems swirled across entire continents, crackling with electrical discharges that would fry any unshielded electronics. Mountain ranges thrust up from the surface like jagged teeth, their peaks covered in frozen water that somehow remained solid at temperatures below zero. Vast bodies of liquid water stretched to the horizon, their surfaces churned by winds that registered on his instruments as powerful enough to level cities. "Commander," his pilot Grix whispered, her voice tight with fear as she fought to keep the shuttle stable against buffeting winds. "The atmospheric disturbances are unlike anything in our training simulations. These humans navigate through this chaos regularly." Zealith checked his instruments. The wind speeds they were encountering would be classified as a major natural disaster on most Council worlds, requiring immediate evacuation of all surface installations. On Earth, they barely registered as noteworthy weather. According to their meteorological data, this is what they consider a clear day with moderate winds, he replied, still not quite believing his own words. The landing site Admiral Chun had designated was in a region humans called Colorado, supposedly chosen because it offered comfortable environmental conditions for the meeting. As they touched down, Zealith's sensors registered gravity at 9.8 meters per second squared, atmospheric pressure that would crush most Council species' respiratory systems, and an altitude that left the air so thin his people would suffocate within minutes even with atmospheric processing. The humans considered this comfortable. A delegation was waiting for them as they disembarked, and Zealith got his first direct look at the species that had accidentally conquered one of the galaxy's most feared military forces. They were tall by Council standards, though not unusually so, with only 2 arms and 2 legs in a configuration that seemed almost fragile compared to most galactic species. No natural armor, no obvious weapons, no visible adaptations for high-gravity environments beyond what appeared to be unusually dense bone structure. Admiral Chun stepped forward as Zealith's group approached, moving with an easy confidence despite the crushing gravity. She was smaller than he had expected, her frame looking almost delicate, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made Zealith's survival instincts twitch uneasily. "Commander Zealith, welcome to Earth," she said, extending one hand in what his briefings had identified as a human greeting gesture. "I hope the environmental conditions aren't too uncomfortable." Zealith reached out with one of his own arms, then immediately regretted it as Admiral Chen's grip nearly crushed his fingers through the reinforced gloves of his suit. The casual strength in that handshake was beyond anything he had expected from such a seemingly delicate species. "Thank you for accommodating us, Admiral," he managed, trying not to wince as he extracted his hand. "Though I must admit, your definition of comfortable differs significantly from galactic standards." Chen's lips curved upward in what his cultural briefings identified as a smile. Though in a world full of apex predators, the display of teeth seemed somehow threatening. "We selected this location specifically because it's at a lower altitude than most of our major population centers. The air pressure here is actually quite thick by our mountain standards." Thick. The air that was slowly crushing his respiratory system despite full environmental protection was considered thick by human standards. "Admiral, if I may ask, where do most of your people live in relation to sea level?" "Oh, all over really. We've got major cities from sea level up to about 4,000 meters altitude. Some of our mining and research operations go higher. We've got permanent installations above 5,000 meters. Zealotha's environmental systems screamed warnings at the thought of functioning at such altitudes. At 5,000 meters, the atmosphere pressure would drop to levels that would cause most council species to lose consciousness within seconds. But let's head inside, Chun continued, gesturing toward a nearby building. We've set up a conference room with enhanced life support systems for your comfort. As they walked toward the structure, Zealith noticed details that his briefings had failed to prepare him for. The building itself was constructed to withstand the planet's violent environmental conditions, reinforced against seismic activity, resistant to the corrosive atmosphere, designed to function through temperature variations that would shatter most galactic construction materials. More unsettling were the humans they passed. Children, offspring barely mature enough to walk, were playing in the crushing gravity as if it were nothing. Elderly individuals moved with steady confidence despite what should have been bone-crushing environmental stress. Most shocking of all, he observed several humans engaged in what appeared to be voluntary physical exercise, deliberately subjecting themselves to even greater stress than their environment already imposed. "Admiral," he ventured as they entered the building, "is it normal for your people to engage in physical activity that exceeds environmental stress levels?" Chun followed his gaze to where a group of humans were lifting heavy objects repeatedly in some kind of ritualized training. "Oh, the gym? Yeah, pretty standard. If we don't maintain our physical conditioning, the gravity starts to feel uncomfortable. These beings lived under gravitational stress that would cripple his people, and they considered additional conditioning necessary to remain comfortable. The conference room was a revelation in itself. The humans had somehow modified the atmospheric composition to be breathable for council species while maintaining their own comfort, installed gravity compensators that reduced the environmental stress on his delegation, and provided seating designed for non-human anatomy. The level of technological sophistication required for such accommodations was staggering, especially accomplished so quickly. "Before we begin formal discussions," Chin said once everyone was seated, "I thought you might want to hear from General Morrison about the correct situation. He's been coordinating their medical care and repatriation efforts." The human who entered was even larger than Admiral Chun, with what Zealith was beginning to recognize as the typical human build. Dense muscle structure adapted for high-gravity environments, bone density that could withstand crushing force, and that same casual confidence that came from being an apex predator in a world full of apex predators. "Commander Zealith," General Morrison said, his voice carrying undertones that rumbled at frequencies most council species couldn't even hear. "Good to meet you. I understand you're familiar with Krek's military doctrine." "I've studied their invasion patterns, yes. They're considered one of the most effective conquest forces in the galaxy." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's what we gathered from their own descriptions. Impressive resume, dozens of conquered systems, millions of casualties, feared across multiple sectors. Really built up quite a reputation. And yet they surrendered to you within hours of landing. Well, surrendered might be too strong a word. More like they politely requested asylum after their invasion strategy encountered unexpected complications." Zealith leaned forward as much as his environmental suit allowed. "General, what exactly happened during their landing operation?" Morrison consulted a tablet device, though Zealith suspected the human had the details memorized. Initial landing force of 10,000 warriors established a beachhead in the Sahara Desert at 0800 hours local time. Standard Krek's protocol, massive show of force, intimidation displays, demands for planetary surrender. Standards so far. Environmental conditions at the landing site were 48 degrees Celsius, humidity near zero, moderate sandstorm activity. What we classify as a typical summer day in that region. And the Krek's response? First heat casualty occurred 18 minutes after landing. Within an hour, 60% of their force was suffering from heat exhaustion. By the 2-hour mark, we had to deploy emergency medical teams to prevent fatalities. Morrison brought up a holographic display showing the landing site. Zealith could see Krek's warriors, beings he knew to be nearly 3 meters tall with natural armor plating, being loaded onto human medical transports like refugees from a natural disaster. The interesting part, Morrison continued, was their tactical assessment. Once their medics understood what was happening, they started requesting detailed environmental data for the rest of the planet. They wanted to plan alternative landing sites. They wanted to identify anywhere on Earth where their species could survive long enough to conduct negotiations. Turns out, there isn't much. Our polar regions are too cold, our temperate zones are too humid, our mountains are too high altitude, and our valleys are too hot. Admiral Chen leaned forward. That's when they made what they called a strategic evaluation of indigenous defensive capabilities. Meaning, they decided that any species capable of not just surviving, but thriving on a world that was actively trying to kill them must represent a military threat beyond anything they'd previously encountered. Morrison nodded. Their exact words were, "We cannot conquer beings who have conquered their own world." Apparently, every other species they've faced has been evacuated from dying worlds or lived on garden paradises. They've never encountered anything like us. Zealith felt a chill that had nothing to do with his environmental systems. The Kreks had built their entire military doctrine around conquering species that needed protection from environmental threats. They had no framework for dealing with beings who used environmental extremes as a form of casual recreation. General Morrison, he said slowly, what were the Kreks' casualty figures from environmental exposure alone? Total? About 8,000 troops required medical intervention for heat-related conditions. Another 1,500 needed treatment for altitude sickness when they tried to establish mountain positions. Maybe 200 suffered respiratory problems from humidity exposure. And combat casualties? Morrison exchanged a glance with Admiral Chun. None. None. Commander, we never fired a shot. The only hostile action we took was providing medical assistance and climate-controlled shelter. Most of their warriors are still in our field hospitals, not because they're injured, but because they literally cannot survive outside our controlled environments. The implications crashed over Zealith like one of Earth's devastating weather systems. The most feared military force in the galaxy hadn't been defeated by human weapons or tactics. They had been defeated by the very environment that humans considered home. But the reports mentioned encounters with your local wildlife. Chen's smile returned, and again Zealith was struck by how unsettling the expression looked on a world where everything seemed designed to kill. That's actually an interesting story. 3 Krek scout teams encountered what they classified as indigenous apex predators while attempting to establish forward positions. The results? Well, the first team radioed for immediate extraction after encountering a family of bears. Apparently, their threat assessment indicated they were facing armored predatory units with crushing bite force and pack coordination capabilities. Morrison pulled up another display, showing what appeared to be large, fur-covered quadrupeds. Brown bears, about 300 kilograms, omnivorous, generally avoid human contact unless protecting cubs or food sources. The Kreks classified them as military threats. High-priority military threats. Their scout teams were equipped with standard battle armor and energy weapons, but they deemed the tactical situation too dangerous to engage. Admiral Chun continued the briefing. The second team encountered a pack of wolves and immediately went into defensive formation. Spent 6 hours calling for backup before we could explain that the animals weren't actually attacking. They were just curious. And the third team? Morrison's expression grew even more amused. Mountain lions. 3 Kreks warriors, full battle gear, advanced weapon systems. Radioed a priority distress call, reporting ambush predators with advanced stealth capabilities and precision strike tactics. Zealith stared at the displays showing Earth's wildlife. To his eyes, the creatures looked exactly like what the Kreks had described. Armored predatory units, pack hunters, stealth ambush specialists. The fact that humans shared their world with such beings and consider them merely part of the local ecosystem was terrifying. "Admiral, General, I need to understand something," he said finally. "Your people evolve alongside these predatory species." "Not just alongside them," Chen replied. "We competed with them. Early human history is essentially a record of our species establishing dominance over every other apex predator on the planet." "You fought them for territory?" Morrison nodded. "Fought them, domesticated some of them, learned from others. Our ancestors didn't just survive on Earth, they turned it into their hunting ground." The temperature regulation in Zelith's environmental suit was struggling to keep up with his body's stress response. These humans hadn't just adapted to a death world. They'd conquered it so thoroughly that they considered its deadliest predators to be minor inconveniences. "Commander," Admiral Chen said gently, "I think there's something about human development you should understand before we discuss galactic integration. Which is, we didn't just evolve to survive on Earth. We evolved to dominate it. Every system in our bodies, every instinct in our minds, every aspect of our culture is built around the assumption that we are the apex predators in any environment we enter." Zelith looked around the room at the humans who had accidentally conquered a galactic military power through the simple act of offering medical assistance. Warriors who had been feared across dozens of star systems were now refugees in human hospitals, protected by the same species they had come to subjugate. "Admiral, what exactly are your people planning to do with the Krex invasion force?" "Well, that's part of why we asked for diplomatic assistance. We've never had to repatriate an entire conquered army before. Most of them seem genuinely grateful for the medical care and are requesting permission to remain on Earth as refugees rather than return to their empire." "They want to stay? On your death world?" Chen's smile widened, and for the first time, Zelith realized it wasn't entirely friendly. "Commander, I don't think you understand. Earth isn't a death world to us. Earth is home. And, apparently, after spending a few days here, a significant portion of the galaxy's most feared warriors have decided they'd rather live under human protection than return to their own military hierarchy." Morrison nodded. "Turns out, once you get them into climate-controlled environments, they're actually quite pleasant to deal with. Very respectful, surprisingly civilized. They keep asking about human military doctrine and whether we'd be willing to provide defensive assistance to their homeworld. They want you to protect them. Apparently, word has gotten back to the Krex Empire that their invasion force encountered something unprecedented. Other galactic powers are starting to take notice of their failure here. They're worried about retribution from rivals who might interpret their defeat as a sign of weakness." Zelith's mind raced through the implications. If the humans accepted the Krex as refugees, it would fundamentally alter the galactic balance of power. Other military forces would have to reconsider their own capabilities in light of what had happened here. More importantly, species across the galaxy would start asking questions about how a previously unknown civilization had accidentally become a regional power through acts of medical charity. "Admiral, has your government considered the broader implications of this situation?" "Oh yes," Chen replied, though something in her tone suggested she found the question amusing. "We've been in contact with representatives from several other systems since news of the Krex surrender spread. Apparently, there's quite a lot of interest in establishing diplomatic relations with Earth." "What kind of interest?" Morrison consulted his tablet again. "As of this morning, we've received formal requests for defense treaties from 12 different systems, applications for refugee status from 6 species fleeing various conflicts, and rather urgently worded inquiries about our military capabilities from what appear to be several galactic governments." "Defense treaties?" "Systems that have been threatened by the Krex or similar military powers. They want to know if we'd be willing to provide protection in exchange for various considerations. Trade agreements, technology exchanges, resource sharing, that sort of thing." Admiral Chin stood and walked to the window overlooking the surrounding landscape. Outside, Zelith could see humans going about their daily activities in an environment that would kill most galactic citizens within hours. Children playing in crushing gravity, adults working in corrosive atmosphere, elderly individuals functioning normally at altitudes that would cause fatal hypoxia in most species. "Commander," she said without turning around, "I think it's time we discussed what humanity might be able to contribute to galactic civilization. And, more importantly, what galactic civilization might need to understand about us before we proceed with formal contact." The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened on Centris Prime 3 days after Commander Zelith's initial report reached the capital. In the massive amphitheater that had hosted thousands of diplomatic discussions over the centuries, representatives from 47 species sat in stunned silence as they absorbed the implications of first contact with humanity. Chancellor Vorix of the Altarian Federation stood at the central podium, his 4 arms gesturing animatedly as he reviewed the data that had shattered their understanding of what was possible in galactic civilization. Behind him, massive holographic displays showed impossible images. Human children playing in gravitational conditions that would crush most council species, vast cities thriving in atmospheric compositions that were literally toxic to most known life, and, most unsettling of all, the medical reports from the Krex invasion force. "Fellow representatives," Vorix began, his voice carrying clearly through the universal translation matrix. "We are faced with a situation that challenges every assumption upon which our galactic community has been built." The Thoraxian delegate, whose crystalline form refracted light in nervous patterns, spoke first. "Chancellor, our xenobiological experts have reviewed the data 3 times. The environmental conditions described are beyond anything in our classification systems. Class 12 death worlds are theoretical constructs. We never imagined any species could actually evolve on such a planet. Massive atmospheric disturbances they call hurricanes and tornadoes that can level entire regions. Seismic activity that regularly reshapes continental masses. Volcanic eruptions that alter global climate patterns. The Valaxi representative, a graceful being whose gossamer wings had evolved for floating through gentle atmospheric currents, shuddered visibly. And they consider these normal environmental conditions? Not just normal, Vorix replied grimly. According to their cultural data, they have developed recreational activities specifically designed to expose themselves to even greater environmental extremes. They deliberately seek out dangerous conditions for what they term adventure and sport. The display shifted to show images that made several delegates gasp in horror. Humans voluntarily subjecting themselves to gravitational stress through something called mountain climbing, deliberately exposing themselves to temperature extremes through skiing and surfing, and engaging in combat simulations they called martial arts that seemed designed to inflict and endure physical trauma. Elder Zephys of the Aquarian Collective, whose species had evolved in the gentle thermal vents of ocean worlds, spoke in a voice that wavered with disbelief. "Chancellor, are we certain these beings are actually intelligent? This behavior pattern suggests a species driven by suicidal impulses rather than rational thought." "That was our initial assessment," Vorix admitted. "However, the technological analysis tells a different story." The display shifted to show technical schematics that made the assembled representatives lean forward in their seats. The humans had developed technologies that most council species required centuries to achieve, and they had done it independently, while dealing with environmental challenges that would have prevented most civilizations from progressing beyond basic survival. "Their space travel capabilities are particularly sophisticated," Vorix continued. "They achieved interplanetary travel without any external guidance, despite operating under gravitational conditions that make orbital mechanics exponentially more complex." The Nexari delegate, whose species prided itself on technological advancement, interrupted with obvious skepticism. "Surely you're not suggesting they developed this independently? They must have received assistance from some unknown galactic power." "We thought so initially. However, their historical records show clear technological progression over several centuries, with innovations building logically upon previous discoveries. Most significantly, their early space travel was accomplished using chemical propulsion systems that would be inadequate for escaping most worlds, but were sufficient for Earth's extreme gravitational field. The implications slowly dawned on the assembly. The humans hadn't just developed space travel despite their harsh environment. They had developed it specifically to escape that environment, then chosen to return to it. There's more, Vorix continued. The Krex invasion fleet transmitted detailed reports before communication was lost. According to their final transmissions, human defensive capabilities are, he paused, consulting his notes, unprecedented in galactic military history. The Warhawks of the Draconian hegemony leaned forward with interest. General Krax, whose species had built their civilization on military conquest, spoke with grudging respect. We've reviewed the Krex tactical reports. Their assessment of human military potential is disturbing. Explain. The humans never deployed their primary defensive systems. The orbital platforms Commander Zelith observed were described by the Krex as patrol units. According to their engineering analysis, Earth possesses defensive installations capable of orbital bombardment with energy yields equivalent to Stellar-class weapons. A shocked silence fell over the assembly. Stellar-class weapons were theoretical constructs that could crack planetary crusts. Most species considered them too dangerous to develop. Furthermore, Krax continued, the Krex military analysts concluded that human ground forces represent a threat level beyond their assessment parameters. When pressed for specifics, their field commander stated that any species capable of treating Krex warriors as medical refugees rather than military threats should be considered an existential threat to galactic stability. Elder Zephys spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. They treated the invaders as refugees. Vorix nodded gravely. Complete medical care, climate-controlled facilities, protection from local environmental hazards. The humans appear to have responded to an invasion attempt as if it were a natural disaster requiring humanitarian assistance. The terrifying implications of this revelation settled over the assembly like a shroud. The most feared military force in the galaxy had been treated as victims in need of rescue. Chancellor, the Valaxi representative, said carefully, "What are human intentions regarding galactic integration? That's why we've called this emergency session. The humans have submitted a formal application for council membership, along with..." Vorix paused, as if having difficulty believing his own words. Request for guidance on diplomatic protocols for managing refugee populations from failed invasion attempts. The Thoraxian delegates' crystalline form flashed with alarm patterns. They expect more invasions. According to Admiral Chun, several galactic powers have been monitoring the situation with the Krex. The humans anticipate that other military forces may attempt to test their capabilities. They're requesting council assistance in establishing proper diplomatic channels to avoid what they term unnecessary conflicts. General Krax spoke with the tone of a career soldier recognizing a superior force. Chancellor, the humans aren't asking for protection. They're asking for guidance on how to manage the diplomatic consequences of their defensive superiority. Precisely. Which brings us to the core issue we must address. How do we integrate a species that accidentally represents the most significant shift in galactic power balance since the Council's founding? The Assembly erupted in discussions as the full scope of the situation became clear. The humans weren't just another species seeking to join galactic civilization. They were a civilization that had unknowingly positioned themselves as the dominant military power in their region of space, and they were asking for help in managing that dominance responsibly. The Nexari delegate raised a technical concern. Chancellor, their technology appears to exceed Council standards in several key areas. Integration protocols require that new species accept Council oversight of military capabilities. That may prove problematic, Vorix replied. The humans have indicated they're willing to share defensive technologies in exchange for diplomatic cooperation, but they've also made it clear that they consider their defensive systems non-negotiable necessities given their environmental challenges. Environmental challenges? Elder Zephys asked. Vorix activated another display. The humans live on a world where the local fauna includes predatory species that would qualify as apex threats on most Council worlds. They've shared images of creatures they consider harmless local wildlife that our xenobiological experts classify as Category 4 predators. The displays showed Earth's domestic animals, creatures humans lived alongside in their daily lives. To the council representatives, they looked like an army of biological weapons. Pack hunters, ambush predators, creatures with crushing bite forces and territorial instincts. They domesticated these, the draconian general asked with something approaching awe. Not domesticated, Vorix corrected. Enslave them, bred them for specific purposes, turn them into tools for human convenience. Their entire planet is essentially a conquered ecosystem where humans have established themselves as the unquestioned apex species. The room fell silent again as the representatives contemplated what they were facing. This wasn't just a new species. This was a civilization that had achieved absolute dominance over a world that would kill most galactic citizens, then develop space travel as a casual expansion of their territorial control. Chancellor, the Aquarian elder said slowly, what are the humans asking from us? Vorix consulted his communications tablet. Trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, assistance in establishing diplomatic protocols, and, he paused again, defensive alliance treaties. They want our protection, the Thoraxian asked with obvious confusion. No, General Krags replied grimly. They're offering theirs. The humans are proposing to extend defensive coverage to Council worlds in exchange for economic cooperation and diplomatic support. The implications were staggering. A species that had been unknown to galactic civilization 3 days ago was now offering to serve as military protectors for the entire Council. There's more, Vorix continued. The humans have submitted preliminary proposals for what they call environmental adaptation assistance. They're offering to help other species colonize worlds that are currently classified as uninhabitable due to hostile conditions. The Valaxi delegates' wings trembled with disbelief. They want to help us survive on death worlds? They don't consider them death worlds. According to human classification systems, most of what we term death worlds fall into categories they describe as challenging but manageable or requiring standard environmental protection. Elder Zephys spoke what they were all thinking. Chancellor, we're not dealing with a species that wants to join galactic civilization. We're dealing with a species that's offering to reshape it. Vorix nodded slowly. The question before us is whether we're prepared for that kind of change. The humans represent capabilities that could revolutionize galactic civilization or destabilize it entirely. General Krax stood, his massive form commanding attention. Chancellor, with respect, I think we're approaching this from the wrong angle. The question isn't whether we want to integrate humanity into galactic civilization. Then, what is the question, General? The question is whether humanity will choose to integrate us into their expanding civilization. Based on everything we've learned, they don't need us. We need them. The truth of that statement settled over the assembly like a physical weight. For the first time in galactic history, the Council was faced with a species that didn't need their protection, their technology, or their guidance. Instead, humanity was offering those very things to the Council. Chancellor, the Nexari delegate said quietly, what happens if we decline their membership application? Vorix looked around the assembly at representatives who had built their careers on the assumption that the Council represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Then, we hope they remain as patient and peaceful as they've been so far. Because based on current evidence, there's nothing in our combined military capabilities that could stop them from taking whatever they wanted. The emergency session continued for 18 hours as the representatives grappled with the reality that their understanding of power, civilization, and survival had been fundamentally challenged by a species that had accidentally become the dominant force in galactic politics simply by offering medical assistance to their would-be conquerors. Outside the Great Council chambers, across dozens of worlds, species that had spent millennia building their civilizations around the assumption of environmental safety began to wonder what other assumptions they had made that might prove equally fragile when faced with beings who had learned to call hell their home. 6 months after humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the newly constructed human embassy on Centris Prime, watching through reinforced windows as construction crews worked to expand the facility for the third time. What had begun as a small diplomatic outpost had rapidly evolved into the most heavily visited location in council space. The embassy itself was a marvel of engineering cooperation between human and galactic technologies. Environmental systems that could support dozens of different atmospheric requirements, gravity generators that could accommodate species ranging from high-gravity adapted draconians to the delicate atmospheric dwellers from the Galaxy systems, and, most importantly, structural reinforcement that could withstand the presence of human personnel without compromising the safety of more fragile galactic species. Elena's reflection was interrupted by her aide, Marcus Chin, Admiral Chin's nephew, and one of the first generation of humans to be trained specifically for galactic diplomacy. Ambassador, the morning briefings are ready. We got a lot to cover. She turned from the window, still amazed by how much had changed since that first awkward meeting in Colorado. How many new applications today? 17 systems requesting defensive alliance treaties, 12 species applying for refugee status, pending relocation to human-protected space, and Marcus paused, checking his tablet, one rather interesting proposal from the Andromedan Trade Consortium. The Andromedans? I thought they were one of the species still maintaining a cautious observation policy toward humanity. They were. Apparently, recent developments have changed their perspective. Elena settled into her chair, accepting the datapad that contained the day's diplomatic correspondence. The volume of communication humanity received had grown exponentially as word of their capabilities spread throughout galactic civilization. What had started with the correct surrender had snowballed into a complete reorganization of galactic power structures. Before we get to the new items, she said, what's the status on our current commitments? Marcus activated the holographic display that dominated one wall of the office. A three-dimensional map of local galactic space appeared, with various systems highlighted in different colors. Green systems are now under formal human protection through defense treaties. We're currently providing security coverage for 48 different worlds. Elena studied the map. The green markers had spread like a benign infection across their region of space, representing hundreds of billions of beings who had requested human protection from various threats. Any issues with our response capabilities? Actually, the opposite. Admiral Rodriguez reports that our defensive presence has been so effective that most potential aggressors are avoiding these systems entirely. We haven't had to engage in active military operations since the Valdoran incident 3 months ago. The Valdoran incident had become a case study in human diplomatic efficiency. When a militaristic species had attempted to claim mining rights to an asteroid belt in human-protected space, a single human frigate had responded to the territorial dispute. The would-be aggressors had taken one look at the vessel's specifications, analyzed the tactical implications of engaging a species that had conquered a death world, and had immediately requested mediation through official diplomatic channels. The deterrent effect is exceeding all projections, Marcus continued. Intelligence reports suggest that several aggressive species have fundamentally altered their expansion strategies to avoid contact with human-protected space. And our refugee resettlement programs? The map shifted to show orange markers scattered across various systems, currently managing refugee populations from 16 different conflicts. Most are requesting permanent relocation to human-administered worlds rather than repatriation to their original systems. This had been one of the most unexpected developments. As humanity's reputation for providing effective protection spread, species fleeing various galactic conflicts had begun specifically requesting asylum in human space. What had started with the Krex warriors who chose to remain on Earth had evolved into a massive refugee resettlement program. The interesting part, Marcus added, is that most refugee populations are adapting to human environmental standards faster than anticipated. Our medical teams report that exposure to higher gravity, higher stress conditions is actually improving long-term health outcomes for many species. Elena nodded. It turned out that most galactic species had been living in such carefully controlled environments that they had lost much of their evolutionary resilience. Gradual exposure to more challenging conditions, still far milder than Earth's environment, but more demanding than their homeworlds, was triggering beneficial adaptive responses. "Now," she said, "tell me about this Andromedan proposal." Marcus's expression grew amused. "They're offering to trade their entire database of galactic historical records and technological archives in exchange for human assistance with what they're calling a minor planetary engineering project." Planetary engineering? They want us to help them colonize a world in the Kepler 442 system. According to their surveys, it has excellent mineral resources and strategic positioning, but it's currently classified as uninhabitable due to environmental challenges. Elena pulled up the planetary survey data on her personal tablet. What she found made her laugh out loud. Marcus, their uninhabitable death world, has gravity 8% lower than Earth, atmospheric composition that's actually easier to breathe than our homeworld, and surface temperatures that rarely exceed 30 degrees Celsius. I know, by human standards, it's practically a vacation resort. The Andromedans are offering their entire civilization's knowledge archive for our help in colonizing what we'd consider a paradise world. This had become a recurring theme. Galactic species were discovering that humanity's definition of habitable included worlds that other civilizations had written off as impossible to settle. Human colonization efforts were opening up vast regions of space that had been considered unusable, effectively doubling the known habitable worlds in Council space. What's our response? The colonial administration is interested. They're proposing a joint colonization effort, human environmental engineering expertise in exchange for Andromedan historical and cultural knowledge. Both species benefit, and it establishes another precedent for cooperative development projects. Elena approved the proposal with her digital signature. These joint ventures had become one of humanity's most valuable contributions to galactic civilization. Human environmental adaptation capabilities, combined with alien species' specialized knowledge, were proving incredibly effective. "Ambassador," Marcus said, shifting to a more serious tone, "there's something else we need to discuss." The Council has received formal communications from several previously unknown galactic powers. Unknown powers? Species and civilizations from other regions of the galaxy who have been monitoring the situation here. Word of humanity's effectiveness has apparently spread much further than we anticipated. Elena felt a familiar chill. This was the scenario that had kept human leadership awake at night since first contact. The possibility that their actions in local space would attract attention from larger galactic powers with unknown intentions. What kind of communications? Marcus activated a new display showing extended galactic maps with regions marked as previously uncontacted. 3 different interstellar confederations, 2 galactic empires, and what appears to be a collective of artificial intelligences have all sent exploratory delegations requesting information about human capabilities. Their intentions? Mixed. 2 of the confederations are requesting diplomatic relations and possible alliance negotiations. One of the empires is offering trade agreements and technology exchanges. The other empire, Marcus paused, consulting his notes, is making what could be interpreted as either diplomatic overtures or subtle threats. Elena studied the data, recognizing the pattern that had defined humanity's galactic experience so far. Let me guess. They want to know if we represent a threat to their territorial integrity. Essentially, yes. The hegemony of worlds is requesting detailed information about human military capabilities, territorial claims, and expansion intentions. Their diplomatic language is polite, but intelligence analysis suggests they're conducting a threat assessment. This was the delicate balance that humanity had been walking since their first contact with galactic civilization. Their defensive capabilities were so far beyond galactic norms that other species couldn't determine whether humans represented a protective force or an existential threat. And the artificial intelligence collective? That one's actually the most intriguing. They're requesting permission to establish what they call a research partnership to study human adaptation and survival strategies. Apparently, their analysis of our civilization has identified patterns that contradict their understanding of biological evolution and technological development. Elena leaned back in her chair, contemplating the scope of what humanity had stumbled into. 6 months ago, they had been a single-world civilization making their first tentative steps into galactic space. Now they were fielding diplomatic inquiries from galactic superpowers and artificial intelligence collectives that spanned thousands of star systems. Marcus, what's the consensus from Earth Command on how to proceed? Cautious expansion of diplomatic contact, continued focus on defensive rather than offensive capabilities, and maintaining our reputation for humanitarian assistance. The Colonial Council is particularly interested in the possibility of accessing the historical databases these older civilizations possess. Elena nodded. Humanity's rapid rise to galactic prominence had been built on their defensive superiority and willingness to help rather than conquer. Maintaining that reputation was crucial as they encountered larger and potentially more dangerous galactic powers. There's one more thing, Marcus added. We've received a priority communication from the Krex Empire. The Krex? What do they want now? They're requesting formal military alliance negotiations. Apparently, their homeworld is facing invasion threats from one of those newly contacted galactic empires. They want human protection. Elena stared at the communication. The species that had once considered themselves the galaxy's premier military force was now requesting protection from the civilization they had originally come to conquer. Their exact words, Marcus continued, reading from his tablet, were the warriors of Krex request the honor of standing alongside the apex predators of Earth in defense of civilization itself. The irony was overwhelming. The same species that had dismissed humans as weaklings on a dying world were now requesting the privilege of fighting beside them against threats they couldn't handle alone. What does Earth Command recommend? Conditional acceptance. The Krex have proven to be reliable allies since the original incident, and their local knowledge of galactic military threats could be valuable. Plus, it sends a clear message to other powers about human willingness to protect former enemies who choose cooperation over conflict. Elena approved the preliminary negotiations, then stood and returned to the window overlooking Centris Prime. Below, she could see beings from dozens of species going about their daily lives in the shadow of human protection. Construction crews were expanding infrastructure to accommodate the growing number of species seeking closer ties with humanity. Merchant vessels from across Council space crowded the orbital facilities, carrying goods and technologies destined for human worlds. 6 months ago, humanity had sent a simple distress call requesting assistance with what they thought was an invasion. Instead, they had accidentally revealed themselves to be the most significant force for stability and growth in galactic civilization. Ambassador, Marcus said quietly, do you think we're ready for what's coming next? Elena watched a group of human children playing in the embassy's recreational area alongside young beings from a dozen different species, all of them adapting to slightly elevated gravity and more challenging environmental conditions than their species had experienced in millennia. They were growing stronger, more resilient, more capable of handling whatever challenges the universe might throw at them. Marcus, 6 months ago, the galaxy thought it knew what strength looked like. They assumed that advanced civilizations could only develop under perfect conditions, that intelligence was incompatible with environmental challenges, and that military might was the measure of species' worth. And now, Elena smiled, watching as a young Krex warrior, one of the refugees who had chosen to remain in human space, carefully taught a group of mixed-species children how to navigate obstacle courses designed for high-gravity environments. Now, they're learning that real strength doesn't come from avoiding challenges. It comes from turning challenges into advantages. The galaxy spent millennia building civilizations that would collapse the moment their perfect environments were threatened. We built a civilization that gets stronger every time the universe tries to kill it. She turned from the window, looking at displays showing human-protected space expanding steadily outward, species after species choosing cooperation over conquest, and former enemies becoming allies in the face of unknown threats from the deeper galaxy. "Whatever's coming next," she said with the confidence of a species that had learned to call hell home, "I think we'll adapt. We always do." Outside the embassy windows, the first generation of truly galactic citizens, beings from dozens of species who had learned to thrive under human guidance, continued their daily lives in gravitational and atmospheric conditions that would have been considered impossible just months before. They were living proof that evolution was not about perfection, but about adaptation. And adaptation, as the galaxy was rapidly learning, was humanity's greatest strength.